Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also become a bitter pill by reaching out to us at patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. And today I'm pretty excited. I've got a good friend of the show, Adrian Botoreda, who's activist, and he's been around the earth doing a lot of amazing things, and he's been on the show a few times to talk about various and sundry subjects. But we're also very excited because today we have a gentleman who is a Green Party pillar who has run for office before. He's run for governor. He's run for Senate. And he hails out of upstate New York. He is Howie Hawkins. Howie, are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, Howie, I really appreciate you doing this with us, man. Thank you for coming on the show.
No problem.
Hey, so listen, man, let's just jump right into it because I know Adrian's here, and we're probably going to have a big old chat. But I wanted to take the simple part first. I mean, I've talked to a couple of my friends, told them you were coming on, and one smart aleck said something like, "Well, tell him not to run." And I was like, and I immediately just went, I know the guy, so I went, why? Because, well, he's going to spoil the election. And I said, really? Because we really need a President Biden, so what are we going to spoil, okay? And so, I mean, that's kind of a setup, but, to that point, what say you with these people? Because personally, I think it's a stupid idea. I think if you're an American citizen, you want to participate in democracy, you should.
Yeah, the Green Party brings up issues that the two major parties won't deal with. And why should we be limited to two parties in this country? I mean, the old Soviet Union had a one-party state. We got a two-party state. Is it that much better?
Right.
Both parties are bought and paid for by the wealthy people of this country. So, most of us, the working people, really don't have a party that represents us.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I mean, so I know you had run for office before. What's kind of prompting this run? Was it kind of the disgust from what happened last time, or where are you at with all of this in terms of wanting to explore, have a committee to explore running?
Well, we face life or death issues. We got a climate emergency. We got a new nuclear arms race, and we have most of the major nuclear powers weapons on hair trigger alert, which could go off by accident, if not, because of, deliberate conflict. And then people every day are having trouble paying the rent, paying for medical bills. The study done by AP found that 40% of people in any 1 year can't make those basic bills, and 80% of us over the course of our lifetimes have to go on public assistance to get by. So these are crises for people every day. And when it comes to medicine or paying for your food or having a place to live, it can be life or death. So these are really important issues and are not getting solved by the two parties in power now.
So, Howie, how are you? This is Adrian. On that note, and connecting it to what you said a little bit earlier, and I could not agree with you more, of course, on both the issue of a corrupt two-party system, being all the necessary motivation that anyone should have in order to opt to support or even participate in third-party politics, but also with the issue of what you're talking about, 30 years of progressive and consistent worsening of the condition of the working class. In your opinion, having been around the block politically, for so many years, what do you see as the obstacle in this country, given those conditions to which the American working class has been subjected, for the emergence and the consolidation of a third party, especially one that's left, and more specifically one that's a workers' party, i.e., a socialist party?
Well, the left in this country, the most of it, has focused on trying to get reforms through the Democratic Party. And what that has done is enabled the Democratic Party to take them for granted and keep moving to the right as the Republican Party goes right off the spectrum on the right.
Yep.
And the Democratic Party is, very corporate in terms of the policies it actually implements, and very warlike. I mean, there are no wars that have been fought, since Vietnam that the Democrats weren't completely behind. So that's one problem. The left has not decided that they've got to speak for themselves rather than what I call political ventriloquism, where you try to get a liberal Democrat to do and say what you want. And that's very frustrating. When we do get them to move, it's when we challenge them independently. I mean, here in New York, I got 5% of the vote running for governor in 2014, and Governor Cuomo, who's a corporate Democrat, had to adopt a number of the things we were raising because, he wanted to roll up the vote and get ready to run for president. And he actually got less votes in that second time he ran than he did in his first. And he looked at the 5% of the votes we got and said, what were they talking about? One of the things was a ban on fracking, which we got in New York. Another was the $15 minimum wage, which he made moves toward. We don't have it for most of us, but there's a schedule to get there. Tuition-free higher education. He had Bernie Sanders come out and unveil a program which he claimed was tuition-free. It's not, but he had to make that move. And paid family leave is something we got in New York and was one of the key things we were raising in 2014. So you don't have to win the office to move the debate and leverage the political system. And so that's what the left needs to do. Now, the other side of it is, those of us who are trying to build an independent party on the left, like the Green Party, what do we need to do? And I think one of the things we've failed to do, but need to do and can do, is establish the party as a self-financing, dues-paying membership party. One of the problems today in politics is we're all in our little silos and getting orders from, nonprofits funded by liberal billionaires telling us what to do next. We don't talk to each other. We aren't organized. We're atomized. And so that all channels back into the Democratic Party. If we're going to have an independent party, nobody's going to fund it but us. And so I think we've got to establish real grassroots chapters of the Green Party, or a left party in this country, and learn how to organize. The Greens are the most reliable activists you'll find. We show up. When there's a demonstration or we got to talk to our representatives and lobby them, we do it. But we're not so good at organizing, the kind of organizing unions do or community organizers do. And there are a lot of techniques and things there that we need to learn how to do. We got to be more than activists. We got to be organizers and build real organizations that sustain the movement through its ups and downs. So I think those are the two sides of it. We got to decide to speak and act for ourselves independently, and then we got to build real grassroots organization.
Well, talking on policy a little bit, just real fast, because I believe that that's what's going to get these people out for you, out in the street, because honestly, 100 million people in the last two cycles stayed home because there was nothing compelling for them to come out and vote for. For example, if you were to run and were to become president, what's a good practical way, for example, to ensure a Medicare for all program? And I know some of the numbers. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And like a couple of how-tos on how you would do that.
Well, Medicare for all has been on the agenda since the mid-1930s, when the Committee for Economic Security that Roosevelt formed recommended it along with Social Security and some other reforms. And Roosevelt decided that the American Medical Association, the doctors, wouldn't go for it, so we'd have to save that for a more politically expedient time. And that time came in the mid-1940s as we were coming out of World War II, and Democrats did put legislation in, and it was in the Democratic platform from 1944 until Clinton got the nomination in 1992 and took it out. It was called national health insurance. So one lesson there is the Democrats are not going to do it. We know at this point Bernie Sanders is getting a lot of support for it. The public opinion polling going back to the 1940s show that the majority of people are for it. But the problem is, and this is the basic problem of American politics, public preferences don't translate into public policy. Mm-hmm. And that's because on these progressive reforms, the Democrats have been the go-to party, and they respond more to their donors than to their voters. So what we've got to do is get a big vote for the Green Party, and we're for Medicare for all, and tell the Democrats, if you don't enact Medicare for all, you're going to keep losing votes to us. I think that's how we get the political leverage. for that kind of program and other programs.
Well, how do you feel? I mean, and this is, I know how you feel about it, but what is a practical, and I hate to use that word, but what's something that a new green president comes in, say, he's still dealing with the entrenched oligarchical parties. How, for example, can you get us out of some of these wars and start cutting back our defense budget so that we can have money to spend, say, on a Medicare for All or a jobs program?
Well, if a green candidate was elected, they'd be elected on a mandate. And that would shock the members of the major parties in Congress, because they know that what the Green candidate ran on was popular. And if that's deep cuts in military spending and devoting that peace dividend to the people's needs and protecting the environment and the climate, then they better move with those programs, or the next congressional election, they could be in trouble. So I think that's what a Green candidate brings, or a Green president brings. They would bring a mandate, and they have a bully pulpit, and if Congress won't act, they can go over the heads of Congress to the people to put pressure on their representatives in Congress.
Howie, of course, going back to how Abe began the show, right? Do you see any particular issues arising from this election? Clearly, the lesser of two evils has been part of American electoral politics now, I think, since I can remember. In your opinion, is there anything particular, given this point in history, given what we're up against, with a Trump presidency? What are your thoughts in terms of the special conditions that a third-party candidate will have to be reckoning with, given these conditions for this upcoming election? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, what would you basically say to folks saying that this is not like other elections? And of course, we've heard that before. But I mean, do you think is there anything to that this is indeed a critical time in our history? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, Trump is particularly objectionable, and that means that the Democrats can't slide Trump. They can't do anything. I mean, this man doesn't care about the people. He only cares about himself. He keeps putting out these racist tropes and incitements of violence to divide us. He's a freeloading leech who doesn't pay his taxes, his creditors, his workers, or his contractors. And he's just lawless. I mean, he flagrantly violates the Constitution and the laws of this country. So, this is a man who should be impeached. But the Democratic leadership won't do it. Mm-hmm. And we have plenty of grounds for impeachment. I mean, from day one, he was violating the emoluments clause. That means he can't personally profit from businesses, foreign governments, or domestically. And he's been doing that from day one. It's kleptocracy. And, he's not representing us with his racism and incitements, his lawlessness. He violates, the law in the way he treats immigrants. He's putting up acting secretaries instead of going to the Senate for advice and consent.
He holds the record on that, by the way. I looked it up.
Yeah, I mean,
he holds the record on that.
Totally in violation of the laws. I mean, those are all grounds for impeachment. The Mueller report is a brief for impeachment. It's loaded with documentation of his, accepting and seeking help from the Russians and obstructing justice. But the Democrats won't impeach him for reasons of political expediency. And this is an old story. Remember, Nixon got elected by what President Johnson called treason when he undercut the Vietnam peace talks.
Right.
That was the October surprise in 1968.
Right.
Reagan did the same thing in 1980 with another October surprise, where they got the Iranians to hold the hostages to hurt Carter until after the election.
See, but just to make a real quick point on the Mueller report, the one thing that I was angered by was the fact that he does have other things in there. And the two things that you mentioned, the obstruction of justice and the emoluments clause, that's grounds for impeachment, not this 3-year sideshow Russian fracas that didn't exist. I mean, because Rachel Maddow thinks that James Bond is a documentary. So, to speak to the things that are impeachable, how do you think that as a Congress, because I think one of the reasons why they won't impeach is because they too can be indicted, not impeached, but they can be indicted and taken out in cuffs for war crimes and everything else. I mean, Nancy Pelosi famously didn't vote to impeach in 2006 when she took over. That seems to be her mantra. So what can we do to get that into the forefront? The things that are real into the forefront of people's and voters' minds, so they basically stop voting against their own interests.
Well, you're exactly right about Pelosi. I mean, another grounds for impeachment was Bush and Cheney lying us into war. Mm-hmm. But Nancy Pelosi spent that whole period making sure the war supplements were voted on in the spring before midterm elections so they wouldn't become campaign issues. Mm-hmm. And now she's right there with Trump on this war for oil in Venezuela while the planet's burning up from burning oil. So, yeah, they're complicit in it. So that's another reason we need the Green Party. Well, because, we will fight the fascists on the right. I mean, we're not going to back off for politically expedient reasons.
Well, I mean, as you said a second ago, the Democratic Party has been full-throated and supported pretty much every war the last 70 years. And for instance, I mean, Venezuela, we're following the same playbook, doing the same exact thing. And the American people seem to have forgotten what we just did last week. I mean, Libya wasn't that long ago. Iraq wasn't that long ago. And people forget we've lost these wars. I don't even think they know we lost these wars. We haven't won them. So where's the impetus for, to keep spending this kind of money from both sides coming from?
Well, from the war and arms industry. I mean, that's the surest profits you can make. It's cost plus contracting with the Pentagon, who can't account for $21 trillion in transactions since between 1998 and 2015. And it's not that all that money's lost. It kind of balances off on both sides of the balance sheet, but they can't account for it. And that is mismanagement and possibly some corruption. So they're all in hock to those people. And that's why they like these wars politically, because it's good, they get donations based on it. And the Pentagon is the most powerful political machine in the country. They put military installations in every congressional district. So even Bernie Sanders, who's talked about cutting the military budget, but he's for the F-35 in his own district in Vermont, which is a plane that even John McCain said was a waste of money. So that's how they, get these two parties captured. And I think public opinion is not for, going off in these wars. I think they realized that, Iraq was a big, big mistake. And the problem is they're not mobilized to stop it. And, the anti-war issue is not on the top of people's minds. I think what is healthcare, economic security, climate is moving up. More and more people are concerned. I think we've turned the corner on that. And so, what we're talking about in the Green Party, and, I've campaigned on, I was the first one in the country for a Green New Deal. And the way I present that is it's both an economic Bill of Rights, like Franklin Roosevelt said, ask Congress to enact as we came out of World War II in a State of the Union speech in 1944 and repeated in 1945. And that would include a job guarantee, like the Works Progress Administration. If you can't find work in the private sector, you go to the employment office, not the unemployment office, and say, I want my job. And local communities have programs on the shelf, and they're funded 90% by the federal government, 10% by local government, and they go to work providing public infrastructure and services. We should guarantee income above poverty for those people who can't work or shouldn't work because they're caring for, old people or their children, young children. Provide everybody with decent housing, Medicare for all, we've talked about that, and tuition-free public education from pre-K, lifelong, right through college. Those are that economic Bill of Rights is central to the Green New Deal. The green part is dealing with the climate crisis and the broader environmental crisis and investing in reconstructing our economy so it's sustainable. 100% clean energy by 2030. Electrifying transportation and relying more on rail networks for freight and urban light rails and intercity high-speed rails. Rebuilding our manufacturing system, which This country doesn't produce much, and, we're going to have a real trade problem if the dollar is not the reserve currency, which it seems to be headed towards sooner or later.
That's right.
And, so we need to rebuild the whole economy. We can't even get to 100% clean energy unless we redo everything from transportation to agriculture. So that's the other part. That's the green part of the Green New Deal. And that's the big investment that will stabilize the economy so that we can provide those economic rights. And that's the kind of program that I think can appeal to people because they both want climate security and economic security, and they won't take the risks to make these changes to have a secure climate and a sustainable environment without being assured that they'll be okay economically. So those two pieces have to go together.
So Howie, staying on the Green New Deal a little bit longer, because I believe that you touched upon a lot of the key things, and I think it's worth noting that as per the Green Party's Green New Deal, you were one of the original and main authors of that. Is that correct, Howie?
Yeah, the European Greens were talking about it, and we were actually talking about it back in 2000. Mm-hmm. But we didn't call it the Green New Deal. We just called it a Global Green Deal. But anyway, yeah, this is core of the Green Party's platform.
Right. It was a fundamental part of Jill Stein's campaign as well, and front and center at that. Recently, as probably a lot of our listeners know, the Green New Deal it's now in possession of Democratic Party rhetoric. Under the leadership of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, correct? And it's being promoted in Congress as the Green New Deal, I believe that, you fundamentally touched. Can you elaborate a little bit further as to what you consider to be the fundamental differences between what you have created, what you have worked on all these years, as a Green Party leader compared to what it's now, being promoted by the Democratic Party?
Well, it's being promoted by the progressives, a small group of progressives in the Democratic Party. Let's remember that when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Sunrise Movement, the Sunrise Movement sat in at Pelosi's office, and Alexandria showed up, and they called for a Green New Deal. And they called for a select committee for a Green New Deal with the power to subpoena witnesses and put legislation on the floor. And Pelosi said, well, okay, I'll think about it. And then pretty soon she said, well, you can't subpoena witnesses. And then she said, you can't put legislation on the floor. And then she said, you can't have it. We're going to have a climate committee. So right there she separated the economic justice from the climate security stuff. And so Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, along with Senator Markey, came back with a non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal. And Pelosi won't bring it to the floor for a vote. McConnell said he would bring it in the Senate side, and when he did, most of the Democrats just voted present, and 4 of them actually voted against it with the Republicans. So the Democrats are not going to do this Green New Deal. Now, I give AOC credit for bringing this up in the Sunrise Movement. We know where they got it from. AOC's campaign manager, V.G. Ramos, was the campaign manager for a Green candidate the year before for a city council seat in Brooklyn, New York. And, they haven't given us credit, but I think the best thing they've done is kept the link between economic justice and climate security, because politically that's how we're going to build the majority that can push this thing through. The problem is they've watered it down. They haven't included all the economic rights. They focused on the job guarantee and Medicare for all, but not housing and education and income guarantee. And then in terms of the environmental side, there is nothing in that, either the original select committee or now the non-binding resolution Green New Deal, that would halt new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is really key for the climate justice movement, because any new structures we build are going to be locked in for the next 40 years burning fossil fuels. So they can't get to 100% clean energy without that. There's no opposition to the phony clean energy systems like nuclear power and biofuels. There's no mention of cutting the military budget to fund the Green New Deal.
Right.
That's where the resources are being wasted.
Right. Yeah.
And So, the Democrats have never been able to do any of these programs on the Economic Bill of Rights or the clean energy side. So that's another reason why the Greens need to be out there promoting this thing and holding them to a higher standard than they've now put forward.
Oh, 100%. I mean, that Pete Buttigieg judge guy is basically running as the gay Obama. It's all identity politics. He so far has talked about values. Seen a couple of interviews when he's pressed on policy. Has none. Says we don't want to put cart before the horse. Let's establish our values. What values? Don't kill people. Don't steal. I mean, what are you talking about? And so he's trading on identity politics like the DNC only knows how to do. But I wanted to piggyback on something you just said, like as a sense of practical matter. Say you were in a debate with the other two, and it's the general election. What kind of steps could we take for an income guarantee, for example? What kind of steps could we implement either through the government or through programs that we could, have a guaranteed an income guarantee? And what kind of income guarantee are you talking about?
Well, I think there are two ways to practically do it. It's got to be built into the tax system. If you do the basic income grant, everybody gets the same amount, and then you tax back a lot of that for the rich folks. The other way to do it is you turn in your taxes, and if you're below the poverty level, you get a check monthly to get you back up to the poverty level, so you're not living below poverty. That's sometimes called the negative income tax. Mm-hmm. I don't have a preference of one for the other. The thing I do want is it be included in a progressive tax structure, so it's fair.
So, before we were talking about, of course, one thing you've done, which I am very encouraged by, is to be very open and very affirming of the driving ideology for what you are promoting and advancing, and for what you believe the Green Party needs to stand for, and of course that's eco-socialism. Simultaneously, we have this new rise of the democratic socialist movement, under the banner of progressive Democrats, and I guess Ocasio and Bernie fall into that category. How do you see the differences, and can you talk to us a little bit about what exactly is Bernie Sanders socialism as you understand it versus what you believe eco-socialism would offer the electorate? Is there a difference there, and can you elaborate from your perspective as to where we stand that in 2020 in terms of how the American people will view both Bernie Sanders' version of socialism versus what you're promoting and advancing under the banner of eco-socialism?
Well, socialism just means economic democracy. We socialize or democratize major means of production, the key industries. And eco-socialism means that we keep production within ecologically sustainable boundaries. And the problem with Bernie Sanders' socialism is he's just talking about social provision of public needs, but not about social ownership or economic democracy. Mm-hmm. And we can't have political democracy without economic democracy, because concentrated economic power translates into concentrated political power. And that's where Sanders comes up short, because these programs like Medicare for All are not secure because the ownership of the economy remains concentrated. That translates into concentrated political power that can undermine programs like Medicare for All. So, he's talking about social programs, not socialism. And, the other thing you hear as well, socialism doesn't work. I would say to people like that, how does your credit union work? Do you belong to a food cooperative? The State Bank of North Dakota works great. Over 2,000 public power utilities in this country work great. And public health care systems around the world provide better outcomes at half the cost or less than we get in the United States with our mixed public and private system, where the private system is basically feeding at the public trough. Mm-hmm. And, then people will say, well, show me where there's a socialist society. I would say we haven't had one yet. I mean, the so-called communist states in the Soviet Union were autocratic state capitalist societies. They exploited wage labor through the party bureaucracy, just like private capitalists do. And then people say, what about Venezuela? Well, Venezuela leadership may have had socialist aspirations, but the economy there is still 70% privately owned. It's about the same level as the United States. So really, Venezuela's economic crisis is an example of the failure of capitalism, not socialism. And I think the thing we have to realize, eco-socialism is necessary because without social ownership and democratic planning to coordinate the kind of investments and the timing to transform all of our production systems to environmental and economic sustainability, it won't get done. I mean, Exxon, Chevron, the Koch brothers are never going to reinvest their earnings from fossil fuels in renewables. So we need to nationalize big oil as one example. And then with that kind of public accountability and direction, we can get to where we want to get.
Right. If you don't mind elaborating, because I know you have ideas behind this, and it's not something that a lot of folks in the United States ever hear about from a possible presidential candidate. Can you talk to us about what are some of the possible transformation or transformative stages and processes that can begin to transfer the ownership of the means of production from the capitalist oligarchical sector into the hands of the people. What are some of the positive successful experiments that you've known about and that you would see as possible things to implement under Howie Hawkins administration, let's say in terms of the promotion and advancement of worker-owned enterprises and the transfer of the means of production into the hands of the worker,
like co-ops and stuff like that, right?
But beyond co-ops,
yeah.
I'm talking about that there are things that were very effective in Venezuela, where the government was in the business of actually financing the creation of worker co-ops, the direct funneling of monies towards communities to administer and fund their own programs. In other words, and that was just towards services, service oriented. But more importantly, I believe. To me, the promise of eco-socialism beyond the important points that Howie just made, I like to maybe go a little bit deeper into what could be done to start shifting the economy, not just towards sustainability, greater efficiency, but also towards just who controls the economy. As long as, and I believe that how we raised it, in terms of Venezuela, a lot of the critiques about why is Venezuela not really socialist is because the state did not move effectively enough towards the sort of nationalization and reallocation of who controls the means of production. So Howie, what do you think?
Well, I think we need a two-pronged approach. There are some industries that should come into the public sector. I mentioned oil. I think Big Pharma is another one. They've totally used their monopolized position to gouge people on drug prices, and they're not doing the research and development of the important things. Like they're not researching how to deal with antibiotic-resistant superbugs, which is a real threat. And the public sector is already doing that through the National Institutes of Health. So those should be operated as public utilities for public benefit rather than for the private profit of absentee owners. And we've had a number of cases in Congress where, people got inside knowledge on legislation and bought into, biomedical and drug company stocks because they knew they were going to benefit. It's totally corrupt. We're talking about Medicare for all. National health insurance is the model that Sanders and J. Paul have put into Congress. And, I go back to the 70s when we had three options. We had the Nixon bill, which was basically, mandated health care like Obama eventually enacted with private insurance. We had the national health insurance model, which is the Kennedy bill. And we called that the Great Leap Sideways because you socialize insurance but you'd keep the delivery and the drug companies private, and they would feed at the public trough. The other model was Ron Dellum's bill, which came out of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, who were patching us up in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the 60s. And they called for public ownership of the hospitals, clinics, and most practices. And doctors would be on salary, not, maximizing income through providing fees for service. And it would also be more accountable because there'd be local health boards elected by the people, and they would federate up at the state and national level to administer the whole system. So you'd have more cost control, better cost control, and better accountability. So that's a case where we need more democracy when we socialize the sector, like healthcare. So those are the public sector kinds of things we need to do. And then in the private sector, co-ops and credit unions and so forth. Yes, it should be government policy to encourage these, provide financing and technical assistance. We have, examples of this. There are a number of cities that are doing it, from Richmond, California to New York City. The number of worker co-ops in New York City has doubled over the last few years while they passed this program that the city council adopted. And Rochester, New York has a program. And so we can do that at the federal level. And we can also, that's to help new startups. We should also help retiring business owners who want to cash out and retire. They don't have to sell it to another capitalist. They could sell it to their own workers. And we could provide tax incentives for that and technical assistance. And I think that's what we need to do. And the more examples we have, I think the more people will want to do it. I spent a couple decades in the construction industry. And actually, one of the first things I did after I'd been working there for about 5 years is we formed a worker co-op that did what we today call green jobs between 1978 and 1983. And what we were doing was energy audits and retrofits for energy efficiency and solar and wind applications. And the only reason we quit was because Reagan pulled out the credits for the high-end, solar and wind applications, and the market really shrunk. And I found, compared to working for another contractor where I got underpaid, or being my own contractor where I made better money, but I was working 24/7.
Right.
Working with the crew on the job, and then, lining up bids for the next job, and doing, back then we used graph paper, not computers, doing payroll and taxes and all that stuff and bids on graph paper. That was killing me. But when I was in the worker co-op, we shared the management side and we shared the laboring side. And that was a happy medium, and I got the full fruit of my labor, not more nor less than I deserved. And I think we know that when workers are, owners and share in management, they're more efficient in production than they are working for bosses. So there's a lot to say for it, and I think in the private sector it needs to be voluntary and encouraged and incentivized. And I think that's how we can move forward on that side of things.
Nice. Well, let me ask you, shifting gears a tiny bit, because you did touch on Venezuela. How do you see us improving our relationships with Venezuela, for example, and Iran if there's a Howie Hawkins White House?
Well, we're at war with Venezuela. The sanctions, first Obama imposed them, and they said they were limited, just hitting 7 military and police officials for alleged human rights violations. But actually, because they had to surveil all the financial transactions and bank accounts of all Venezuelans, it really made it impossible for the Venezuelan state to import food and medicine, which they have to do because they're so dependent on oil exports. They don't have a very diversified economy. So we should, and then Trump has totally, escalated this till the country's being strangled.
Sure.
There was a UN rapporteur for the Human Rights Council that recommended that the countries imposing sanctions, the U.S., Canada, the EU, should be referred to the International Criminal Court because they're violating for war crimes. People are dying because of this. We imposed sanctions on Iraq in the 90s. 500,000 children died. Mm-hmm. And, who was it? Madeleine Albright told Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes that, she was asked, was it worth it? And she said, yeah, I think so. No, it's not. I mean, it's totally immoral. Venezuela has real problems. And when we talk about a Green New Deal, we should talk about a global Green New Deal. The United States should be the world's humanitarian superpower, not its military superpower. We should be helping people. We should be making friends instead of enemies. And Venezuela needs a lot of help diversifying their economy. And another part of the United States is Puerto Rico. I mean, Trump's cutting off aid. They are devastated. That country, that island should be solarized. And instead, they're making them dependent on oil and gas, which is not what we need environmentally, and it's more expensive than solarizing the island. So back to Venezuela, we need to call off the sanctions. And this whole idea of intervening militarily to support a guy that declared himself president when there is an elected president. I'm not saying there aren't problems in Venezuela. I have criticisms of the Venezuelan government in terms of economic policy, some of the way it's handled the democratic issues. But, this president's elected. If we want to start going after countries for, not being democratic, what about Saudi Arabia?
What about Colombia? Colombia's right next door. Yeah. They got a 30% poverty rate compared to Venezuela's 4% poverty rate. They jail campesinos. They murder journalists. They fix elections. Sounds like we should be invading Colombia.
No. We can't invade Colombia because Colombia is part of NATO.
Ah, that's right.
So please be very careful with what you say there, Abe.
And folks, those of you that don't recognize Adrian Botarero, he declared himself the president of Texas not too long ago, and he just came out from the Little Longhorn Saloon on Burnett.
Yes, I get out every once in a while just for this show.
Sorry, Howie, that's an inside joke.
Yeah. So Howie, you did hear, Howie, that they made Colombia a member of NATO, right?
Yeah. I think they're technically a partner, not a member, but the point is they're cooperating with NATO, which is no longer, if it ever was, a defensive alliance to protect Europe from a potential and probably unlikely Soviet invasion. The Soviet Union was devastated by World War II. Mm-hmm. They weren't about to invade Western Europe. But in any case,
and indirect
engages in wars all over the world, and it goes around the UN in violation of international law.
Right.
Whether you're talking about Libya or Iraq. So, NATO is not an organization promoting the peace at this point.
And it's not accidental.
And then people say,
it's not accidental that they gave an associate membership, I believe is what they're calling it, almost like using the same terminology that they do for an associate state as Puerto Rico is concerned. And Brazil has also applied for this associate membership into NATO, and it's awaiting that process, which to me it seems like from a geopolitical perspective quite interesting that all of a sudden you have one of the sole remaining socialistic countries in Latin America now completely under attack by the United States through sanctions, the threat of war, and now being surrounded in violation, by the way, of Latin American agreements that do not allow for the nuclearization of any of the states in the continent and NATO would de facto be facilitating that connection there. So the geopolitical question, I think, Howie, that you were addressing, I would like you to elaborate even a little bit further, in terms of isn't this a similar case as to what happened in Syria? Isn't this a similar case as to what the undying support of the United States for the Israeli state and their brutal occupation of Palestine? This ultimately brings us to the question of how would a Howie Hawkins foreign policy differ from what the American people have grown used to probably forever. I don't believe that we ever had a constructive, humanitarian growth, people-oriented foreign policy. It's always been a policy that was geared towards colonization, empire, the support of multinational corporations. The whole of Latin America has been a dumping ground of war material and conflicts in order to protect U.S. interests. So how do you, in a bigger picture, but also perhaps also a little bit to follow up with what Abe said about Iran, which I believe it's next on our target list, if not consistently always there. The role of the United States in Israel, it's also something that I believe would probably be very different under your administration if were you to become president of our of our nation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. And I think the United States should back off of geopolitics, realpolitik. This is the old Metternickian, balance of power, blocks of nations, inter-imperialist rivalries. We should just get out of that. That means get out of NATO and engage other blocks, the Russian, Iranian, Syrian, so forth bloc, in negotiations to, first of all, head toward the abolition of nuclear weapons and to reduce tensions and militaries across the board and try to get those resources put in to meeting people's needs and protecting the environment and not get caught up. We should be with the people of the world. I mean, every country is different. I mean, there was no, popular uprising in Venezuela for democracy because they had a democracy. It was just the right wing wanted power, and they're not that damn democratic. In Syria, that was part of the Arab Spring. There was a popular uprising, and that revolution was caught between two counter-revolutions. The intervention of the Gulf states and Turkey and the United States to support Islamic fundamentalists, and then the Assad side, which was very repressive. I mean, Assad used to torture people for Bush and Cheney. It was a black site for secretly renditioned terrorism suspects. And he went to war with us in the Gulf, or his father did, in the first Gulf War. I mean, there's nothing to defend about that regime. So we should stand with the people. And that means not make decisions based on geopolitical calculations. We're really getting into a new Cold War with, Russia and, its allies on one side and the U.S. NATO bloc on the other. And that is a recipe for annihilation, eventually, nuclear, and a lot of, proxy wars in between. I mean, the Syrian case is, terrible. And, out of 22 million people, half of them are refugees and 500,000 have died. I mean, it's a tragedy.
But when you say I'm sorry to interrupt you, but when you say stand with the people in Syria, for example, what would that mean in a Hawkins administration? And I only ask that because I don't think we belong in Syria at all. We've been bombing them continuously since around 2011 when the Arab Spring got started. What would that look like? How would that be different in your administration?
Well, we make statements in solidarity with democracy and human rights. I agree. The U.S. military can't improve that. The military is not going to impose democracy. And then we've got to be talking to the other countries that are intervening. Half of them are our allies, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Emirates, and Turkey. I don't know if they're an ally, but they're part of NATO. I mean, we have conflicts with them right now. And we need to get them to pull out, and then we need to put pressure on the other side to stay out. Iran and Russia. Everybody should stay the hell out and let the Syrians decide for themselves what they want. And the best thing we can do is set a good example at home. I mean, we violate human rights here all the time. We see it there at the border with, the Trump administration having Border Patrol and ICE separate mothers from their children. I mean, how can we go around the world talking about human rights when we do that? And, the United States values of democracy, what the Statue of Liberty says, people around the world admire that, and that inspires them for their own democratic movements. So the best thing we can do to help them is set a good example at home.
Howie, two things that I would like you to elaborate on based on justice at home. Immigration and reparations.
Okay. Well, I'm for open borders. That doesn't mean no borders, but it means I want to see movement between the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and the other Central American countries, and really all the South American countries, like it is in the European Union. I mean, you show up at the border, tell them who you are, and unless you're a criminal with a warrant out for them or somebody who is suspected of terrorism, you're free to move. And so the borders should be fair trade zones where people, like goods and money, are free to travel across the border for work and shopping and recreation. And I think in terms of the people who are now have a status of being undocumented in this country, they should just be legalized and have a timely path to citizenship. And if people cross the border without identifying themselves, they should be detained and checked out. But that's very different than, not letting people in because we have limits on immigration, or we just don't want them in, which is what the Trump administration is about.
Well, and the media was.
And then
I'm sorry, really quick. But the media was so complicit in that too. I mean, they made it sound like these asylum seekers were no different than what Trump was talking about.
Yeah, certainly Fox News, which is his propaganda arm, was putting it that way. I think a lot of people are outraged by the treatment they saw on the other mainstream news, but the whole debate is about border security, as if there's a real threat there. There's no threat there.
No.
In fact, the way we operate the border now is like Israel operates the border with the Palestinian, the Palestinians in occupied territories, or South Africa used to operate the Bantustans. It's apartheid. And we let them in when we need their cheap labor, and we push them out when we don't. And, that's just a violation of basic human rights and, freedom. I mean, freedom to move is one of the important freedoms. I mean, the past laws we had during slavery, or they had in South Africa, or they had in, with the internal passports in Russia and China under the communists, I mean, that's all in violation of basic human freedoms. And I think we got to get away from that. I was going to say that, the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and Customs and Border Protection, those agencies got to be dismantled. And we need a new immigration agency that would be committed to a humane immigration policy. I mean, there are a lot of people. I mean, I was seeing the other day there's a Customs and Border Patrol local union that uses Breitbart Studios to promote this anti-immigrant racism. And so they are not fit to, administer an immigration policy that respects human rights. And so they need to be, abolished and replaced.
So on reparations, do you have any thoughts? We're quickly beginning to come to the last section of the show, and I believe that it's worth talking about, and it's a sensitive issue, but I believe that it's definitely become something that a lot of people are sharing their thoughts about. What are your thoughts, Howie, about?
Well, I've always supported the bill that John Conyers first introduced in 1989 to form a commission to study reparations for African Americans and find the best ways to make those communities whole. And those communities have suffered oppression, not just during slavery, but in the Jim Crow era, right down to the day where racism is institutionalized. And we just saw, predatory lending aimed at African Americans as well as Latinos and other minorities in the housing bubble. And then when it crashed, the black community lost half its wealth. And that was under the Obama administration, where the banks got bailed out and we got sold out. Mm-hmm. So this is something that's going on to this day. And so what it does is needs to be studied. Now, personally, I think we need both individual reparations and collective reparations. We need some individual reparations just so individual families, get some assets so they can, get a better start in life. But most of it should go to collective reparations, because if we just give people the money within this system that systematically polarizes wealth and income between rich and poor, we're going to end up in the same place we're at now. So what it really requires is community control of the housing, the schools, the businesses, the police in racially oppressed communities, so they are no longer subject to the racists that discriminate against them. The landlords, the real estate agents, the employers, the judges, the lawyers, the police, all those things. You may not be able to convince the racist not to be racist, but you can take the power from them to discriminate away. And I think that is, what the thrust of reparations would be about. It would be about building up communities so they can control their own fates.
Well, listen, hey, Howie, I was going to ask you really quick. We've been talking around this a little bit. What are your thoughts on specifically taking away from the defense budget, or the weapons budget, as I like to call it, and add to some of these programs we're talking about? I was talking about a $20 minimum wage with a friend of mine the other day, and he got kind of hot, and I was like, well, why don't we take $200 billion out of defense, give it to the Department of Labor, and businesses that can only afford $11 an hour can apply for a subsidy to make it $15 or $20 an hour. That's just one idea, and I came up with it when I was, drinking. So how can we sell the American public on the idea that we don't need to occupy 80% of the world, support 73% of the world's dictators with this bloated budget, while we've got infrastructure that needs to be built here at home, and we've got other programs that could be totally funded and not even. I mean, it's like $20 billion a year to feed the hungry in the world, and yet we don't do it. How would you apply or approach taking away from some of the defense money we spend and applying it to where humanities needs help?
Well, I'm advocating cuts on the order of 50 to 75%. 50% is what Robert McNamara and Lawrence Korb, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense, proposed in 1989 when the Soviet bloc started falling apart, and they had it right down to, force structures and weapon systems. Unfortunately, academia and the peace movement don't have those kind of proposals prepared right now. So the details have to be studied. But if we cut the military budget by 20 or 75%, we would still have a bigger military budget than any other country in the world. Our military budget is equal to the next 10 biggest powers, and I think 7 of them are our allies. So this is more about making money for the defense industry and the war industry than defending ourselves. It's actually undermining ourselves, because all the human capital, all the engineers, and all the physical plant that goes into military production and operating the military machine could go into meeting the people's needs. So we need to cut the military budget and invest that peace dividend in the people and protecting the environment. And that's a message I think a lot of people support. The polling shows the American people are about evenly divided on whether we should cut the military budget. But I think that's because we haven't had a real debate upon it. That's why we need a Green Party, because the Democrats and Republicans don't want to talk about it. And, Trump takes the Pentagon budget, adds some more money, gives it to Congress, and they add more money. That's what's happened since Trump's been in there. I mean, this is a pork barrel, not about defense. Well,
they give him a big tip. The first year he asked for money, they gave him $80 billion extra, and I was like, well, I thought he was the crazy man. I thought he was the scary guy. You're going to give him $80 billion more, and then they did it again last year.
Yeah, they're all scary.
Yeah.
Both parties.
So Howie...
Except for a few people on the margins of their parties.
So Howie, what would you say to folks that have an impression, and we're experiencing this, and I want to move it a little bit more, for folks to learn a little bit more about the Green Party itself, and maybe spend a few minutes from you. And I wanted to do it from the perspective of talking about what's happening in Europe, where we're seeing a lot of the Green Parties split or transform, in the case of a lot of the parties in the Nordic countries, transforming exactly into what you are stepping forward to do, which, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you may be one of the first Green Party presidential candidates, if you were to gain the nomination, that would be as openly, eco-socialist and embracing the ideology as you are. In Europe, we are experiencing that split, and the Green Party of the United States right now, in your opinion, where does it stand in that? Let's say between what is happening in Iceland and in Finland, in Holland, where a lot of the Green parties are forming united fronts and with other socialist parties and unequivocally being socialistic and leftist, versus, let's say, parties like the German Green Party that continues to support membership in NATO, et cetera, et cetera. In your opinion, where does the Green Party of the United States fall in that dichotomy, if at all? And if not, how do you see the Green Party of the United States in the 21st century, in 2020, being different, let's say, from the party that you yourself helped found, a while back? I guess, how many years ago was that, Howie?
1984, we had our first national organizing meeting.
Right. So without taking too much more of the time, I'd like you to just share with our listeners, what is the Green Party of the United States today in 2020, 2019, 2020?
Well, the debate on whether the Green Party should be about liberal reforms to American capitalism or a radically new system of economic democracy and eco-socialism, that debate went on, it was pretty vigorous in the 80s and 90s. And over time, I think the socialist wing has won the argument. I mean, of all the people who are considering running for president for the Green nomination, they all say they're eco-socialists. The party platform now has a plank that says that's our orientation. I'm hearing very little resistance to that approach. The difference between us and the European Greens that have formed, left-green type parties is that we don't have any left parties in this country. Really. I mean, they don't exist. The biggest socialist group is the DSA, which most of them are into the Democratic Party. That's the Democratic Socialists of America. There's a socialist alternative. They talk a lot about electing Kshama Sawant in Seattle, but they are oriented toward Bernie Sanders. They even proposed the safe state strategy for Bernie as an independent. In other words, you run in the states where we already know who's going to win, and you don't run in the states where it's close, which some people in the Green Party proposed in 2004 and has been rejected by our Green Party. I mean, you can't even do that because if people go to the trouble getting you on the ballot, they want you to, campaign in their state. So that's a crazy idea. And, there's some socialist groups that are not parties who are not clear on their relationship to the Green Party. So I think we should be open to them, but, they got their own problems, I guess.
Wow.
In Europe, I mean, one thing I'll say for all the Green parties in Europe is they're the only political current there that has opposed this racist anti-immigrant sentiment across the board within the Green parties. Even some parties on the left, whether you're talking about Die Linke, the left in Germany, or the Social Democratic Party, they have currents within their parties that are anti-immigrant. So I'll give all the Green parties credit for that. But you're right. In the Nordic countries, the Netherlands, the UK, the party is more on the left. And I think that's a good sign because we need an eco-socialist solution to the life or death problems we face.
Wow. Hey, Howie, listen, I'd like to go on for another hour, but we're kind of at the end of the time. I really want to thank you so much for coming on to the show. And we obviously unpacked a lot in an hour, and there's so much more. And I know you're kind of in the exploratory phase. I'm hoping that that's just sort of a formality to the inevitability that you were going to announce. And, let's start getting some coverage out there and start, getting the campaign going because it's still early and people need to hear alternative voices. And the Green Party is one of the few voices out there that actually are in the public interest. And folks, that being said, we're wrapping it up. Our guest has been Howie Hawkins and friend of the show, Adrian Botoreda. And you can always become a bitter pill by visiting patreon.com/thebittertruth.com. And guys, again, as if stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to, so sleep tight.